Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kinyora Param. I am the Chief Executive Officer of NRAPE on campus, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this important and timely discussion as part of our annual #Reclaim Red Zones campaign. We are incredibly grateful to have you join us today as we delve into a critical topic of the red zone. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, it is a period of time between moving back onto campus and Thanksgiving break when more than 50% of campus sexual violence cases occur. This time is particularly dangerous for first-year students, and through this campaign, we aim to raise awareness, empower survivors, and transform this high-risk period into one of safety, support, and advocacy. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to truly acknowledge the sensitive nature of our discussion today. Our content will cover issues related to sexual violence, assault, and harassment, and we want to emphasize the importance of taking care of yourself throughout this webinar. So please feel free to step away at any time if you need to. Remember, your well-being is your priority. And if you or someone you know may need immediate support, we do have the following hotlines available for you in the chat. So feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And with that, today we are honored to have Dr. Bill Flack, a leading researcher whose work has significantly deepened our understanding of the red zone, joining us today. Dr. Flack will share invaluable insights on this critical period and discuss actionable steps we can take to create safer campuses. To guide us through today's session, I am pleased to introduce Catherine Tazer, Iraq's Centering the Margins intern. And Catherine has been an integral part of our team, and she will be introducing our guest speaker and moderating today's discussion. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kenyora. I'm so excited to be a part of this year's Reclaim Red Zones campaign and to welcome our special guest, Dr. Bill Flack. Dr. Flack is a professor of psychology at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where he teaches critical approaches to community psychology and psychological trauma. And along with teams of students and colleagues, he has done research on campus sexual assault locally, nationally, and internationally for over 20 years. And some of this research has been focused on victimization rates, risks associated with time, location, and partner relationships. And he's also been a Fulbright Scholar at Ulster University in Northern Ireland and at the University of Galway in the Republic of Ireland. So to kick off our discussion, Dr. Flack is going to share a brief presentation on his positionality, what led him to this important work, and an overview of his research on the red zone. Dr. Flack, we are so grateful to have you here with us. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me and see me okay? Okay, and the PowerPoint slides, they're showing up all right? Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I hope that this will be informative. One of the things that you may know about professors is that they can go on almost forever about almost anything. So if I get close to that 3:25 time and I'm still jabbering, please make sure to remind me. So this, let's see. Okay, so this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. You've already had a content warning, but I certainly want to underscore that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my positionality in regard to doing this kind of work. I was asked to talk about how I got into this line of work, and that actually is related to some pretty important issues that I think cut across really all of the research on campus sexual assault. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then I'm going to give you a summary of the research that's been published that is relevant to the idea of temporal risk, or the notion that time of the academic calendar year is related to risk for being assaulted on college campuses. I'm going to lean very heavily on a relatively recent review of the literature that Diane Fallingstad and colleagues at the University of Kentucky did. It was just published last year, and it really does a wonderful job of both reviewing in detail the research that's been done on this topic, and doing so in a critical fashion, which I think is important. And then, if there's still time left, I'll talk a little bit about what I think we're still missing, what we still need to do as researchers, and how that might translate into action. So again, the content warning here, obviously everybody knows what we're going to be talking about, but I would ask you to please, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And if the content becomes difficult, take a break, come back if you can. Okay, this is a positionality statement, my positionality statement. And I think it's important to do this sort of thing because although some of this may be obvious, a number of my social identities are among the many sort of privileged social identities, right? So I'm an old white guy. I'm a professor, so I have the benefit of tenure. And that means that that it is easier for me to do this kind of work than it is for other people who have different sets of intersecting social identities. So in short, I benefit unfairly from working in an institution and a discipline and a society that are designed and maintained to advantage people like me, and to the disadvantage of those whose identities differ from mine. And I am committed to using my teaching, scholarship, and research to challenge and change my and other institutions, my discipline, which is psychology. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment, and our society to try to achieve social justice. So how I got into this line of work, I originally trained as a clinical psychologist at Clark University back in the Neolithic era of the late 80s and early 90s. I did clinical work for a couple of years. I then did a 2-year postdoctoral research fellowship at the National Center for PTSD at the Boston VA. Which is where I started specializing in psychological trauma. A couple of years after that, I started here at Bucknell University, which is a small liberal arts, mostly liberal arts college. We have colleges of arts and sciences, but also engineering and management colleges as well. But we're a pretty small institution, about 4,000 students, about 400 faculty. And Bucknell is where I've done most of my data gathering research. I've also done some work on campus sexual assault nationally with the Administrator Researcher Campus Climate Consortium Group, or ARC3 for short, which produced a research-based campus climate survey focused on gender-based violence in higher education. And that survey has been pretty successful. It's been used by somewhere over 300 different campuses in the United States, and it's also been adapted elsewhere. So, for example, its adaptation was used for the first national surveys in the Republic of Ireland on sexual misconduct in higher education. So in any event, enough about that. How I got into doing this work in particular has actually to do with students. So when I first started teaching at Bucknell back in the fall of 2000, I was teaching an upper level seminar on psychological trauma. And one of the contexts that we were exploring in that seminar was campus sexual assault. So it's important to note that this was back in the fall of 2000. A lot of water has gone under the bridge on this issue since then. But one of the things that the students noticed as we were talking about the research that had been published at that point, about the Cleary Act numbers that the university was reporting, and about their own knowledge of this problem among people in their social intimacy culture. They were saying, these numbers are very different from each other, right? The national numbers were different from the institutional numbers, which were different from their impression of how prevalent the problem was. And so, long story short, we decided to do a survey. And that survey was eventually published. We did the survey in like 0102. It wasn't published until early 2007. Um, uh, but there were some interesting things that happened there. And one of them was that as we were sitting around a table and trying to figure out what it was we should ask about in our survey, aside from using what was then the standard gold standard measure of sexual assault, which was the then current version of Mary Koss's sexual experiences survey. Students were saying, well, yeah, we need to ask about that. Obviously, we all should ask people, also should ask people about, their use of alcohol. And then they said, and we should also ask people about hooking up, whether or not they hook up. And at that point, my ears kind of perked up and I was like, what's that? Because believe it or not, I had no idea what hooking up was. I had heard of Friends with Benefits because I had watched Sex in the City on HBO, but I didn't really know that it was this sort of, broader phenomenon, which clearly it was. I mean, we'd sort of had versions of that when I was an undergrad, a long, long time ago now, but it wasn't as ubiquitous. And it turned out that hooking up was not only a serious risk factor that is strongly related to people's reports of having been sexually victimized, but actually statistically a stronger predictor of whether or not somebody was going to report sexual victimization than their use of alcohol. And we managed to replicate that finding a number of times, including in a paper that was published more recently in 2016, looking at different types of hookups and the relative risk of different types of hookups based on the degree or extent of relationship between hookup partners prior to a hookup. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. So in any event, the takeaway message here was that I was old enough at that point that I knew some of what we needed to ask about, but also too old to know about everything that we needed to ask about, right? It had been too long since I had been part of a student campus intimacy culture. And so I really want to underscore the vitally important role of students being involved in this kind of research. Um, in a sense, it sort of goes back to the what one of the ideas that came out of AIDS activism. Nothing about us without us. I really feel strongly that students need to be involved in this research. They need to be consultants to it because they're the ones who are actually living in the context in which this problem happens. They are, in fact, the on-the-ground experts. And those of us, whose time in that context has long since passed, we know how to do the research, but we may not know what we ought to be asking about. So that's really important. That's probably one of the main takeaway messages that I would have for you. Okay, so on to research about the red zone. You may or may not be surprised that there's actually relatively little research that's been published about the red zone. There is a wonderful review of the literature on the research that's been published about this topic. The Diane Follingstad I mentioned earlier and colleagues at the University of Kentucky published just last year. And I would encourage you to take a look at this literature review if you are interested in this area. In any event, I'm going to lean on this review very heavily for the rest of what I have to say. So what they did was they scoured the research literature to find studies that were either directly on the notion of there being a red zone, a period of time during which people, or at least some people, are at presumably higher risk of being sexually assaulted than others. And what they found was only 10 studies in the literature that were relevant to this, and only 3 of those 10 studies that actually directly assessed the existence of a red zone. It just so happens that the first 2 of those studies were ones that I was involved in. And each of those studies was done at a small university. And they were done in collaboration with a dear friend of mine and collaborator for decades now, a guy named Matthew Kimball, who's a professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. So I want to give a shout out to Matt because this work is as much his as mine. What Fallingstad and colleagues basically surmise from the results of these 3 studies is that the idea of a delimited red zone, that is the sort of standard idea that we've all heard about, that people are at the most risk at the very first part of the first semester of the first year at school. That's what these 3 studies looked at, simply does not have sufficiently solid support. I'll let that sink in for a minute. They found 6 other studies that did something that was sort of related to the idea of risky time periods, but not really specific to the temporal parameters of what we usually think of as the red zone. So those 6 studies basically compared first-year students' prevalence rates of sexual victimization with students in subsequent years. And what Fallingstad and colleagues summarized from those 6 studies is that there is stronger support for the notion that risk is higher for people in their first 2 years at school. Okay, so we've got a situation where we've got 3 studies, and the 2 studies that I was involved in were very small. In fact, I went back to take a look at those studies again because I hadn't looked at them in a while. One of the studies only had about 100 or so participants in it, and the other one had maybe about 200 or 250. So very, very small samples, even from relatively small institutions, but relatively small numbers of people. And so generalizing from that small number of studies of individual campuses is a really sort of dicey proposition. And one that I think that we need to think about clearly and critically. And the upshot is that we really need more research. We really need more campus climate surveys that are asking people about specific time periods, and not only specific time periods, but also other factors that may interact with periods of time to produce increased risk. So this is a kind of a summary of the table 2 from the Fallingstad review, a summary of their critical findings. So they say, number 1, the red zone does not have solid support to signal the riskiest period for sexual assault. Stronger support exists for the first 2 years as being riskier than the last 2 or 3 years. Understanding what interacts with risk related to time is going to be really important, but we don't have data on the sort of combined risk of things like time plus alcohol plus location and any number of other factors. And then finally, they conclude that future research needs to adopt similar timeframes and record incidents in a way that is similar across institutions for single institution studies, or that's consistent across multiple institution studies. And we simply don't have that yet. So really, in terms of talking about the support for research, or the support in published research for a delimited time, a red zone during the first year, during some part of the first semester of the first year, the available evidence is pretty scant, unfortunately. So, sorry, that's not the most upbeat kind of message that I imagine you had hoped for. But it's kind of a bad news, good news scenario. The bad news is that we need more research. The good news is that we can do more research. And it's certainly easier to do this kind of research in 2024 than it was to do it in 2005 or 2010. Since the Obama administration, since the White House task force in 2014, since Me Too, um, since the advent of the ARC3 survey, and any number of other developments, there's not only a lot more research out there, but there's also a lot more support for it. And there are just also a lot more people who are actually doing this research than there were 20 years ago. So I'm certainly hopeful that one of the things that we will do in the coming years is to refocus on this notion of temporal risk, because I think it's important, especially for individual campuses, right? So one of the two campuses where we got data for our studies back in 07 and 08 did find evidence for a red zone, but it wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was, in fact, at the beginning of the second year, not at the beginning of the first year. And although we couldn't test this proposition directly, one of the things that we knew about that particular campus was that students were not allowed to enter the Greek system, so to join fraternities and sororities, until the beginning of their second year. Likewise, with the other campus that we gathered data from, again, another small, relatively small Northeastern campus, they actually did have a classical red zone, but they also had another period of equally high risk, which was during their what's called a Jan plan. So they had basically a term during the month of January where students take a single course and otherwise, have nothing else to do, for an entire month. And so they had a red zone, but they actually had two red zones. So I think one of the important things that underscores is that to the extent that it's possible, each institution needs to be doing its own campus climate surveys that include asking about risk related to time. Because while there are certainly similarities across universities, within and colleges within the United States, and there are even some similarities between our institutions and institutions in Europe and elsewhere, there are also some pretty significant differences that may result in different time periods being differentially risky for being assaulted. So my hope is that we are going to begin to think more ecologically, as this slide indicates, that we're going to expand our view in terms of thinking about time, in terms of thinking about our institutions, in terms of thinking about how risk may differ given the both the similarities and the differences across various institutions, but then also be thinking about some of the factors that drive both the problem and also attention to the problem. So things like the reinterpretation of Title IX, the changes in policy from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now to the Biden administration. All of these things have significant impacts that we need to be measuring in order to really understand what's going on and to have some hope of eventually, preventing campus sexual assault. So I'm going to stop yammering on at this point because I could go on ad nauseum. But I think I'm already a little bit over my allotted time. So thank you for your attention.
No worries. Thank you so much, Dr. Flack, for sharing all of this foundational research. It's really great to be able to get kind of a broad view of the scope of what's actually being done right now. And so now we'd like to transition into a little bit more of a discussion and just dive deeper into some areas that our audience indicated that they're interested in hearing from you about in our registration form. So, one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation are the many limitations to red zone research and really how this research was just conducted in a different time period than we're in now. Um, and so, considering that now we know that a disproportionate number of people from historically marginalized communities, and like you discussed, those in their first and second years, are at an increased risk for campus sexual violence and violence during their campus's red zone. We're wondering how researchers might have adapted their work, or how you believe that they should adapt their work to better reflect these diverse identities.
Yeah, it's a really good question. What we know so far about the risk for members of the LGBTQIA plus community is that proportionally speaking, their risk seems to be significantly higher for being victimized than for folks who are heterosexual. We don't yet know about whether or not those differences will map onto uh, temporal differences in terms of different times being differentially risky. I think that's something that, certainly we should be asking about, right? And we can do that in a fairly straightforward manner as long as we have in the campus climate surveys that we're doing, good comprehensive demographic questions so that we can know, who it is that's responding to our surveys, as well as, some hopefully largely agreed upon chunks of time, right? That the research field can make some decisions about that would allow us to compare, data across different campuses. And with the combination of those two factors in our data sets, we should be able to say something about relative risk vis-a-vis time. At this point, I am not aware of any analyses that would enable us to actually answer that question specifically. But I think that should be really high on the agenda, given that we know, at least based on the research that we have so far, that folks in the LGBTQIA plus community do seem to be at higher risk for victimization. I think we need to know a lot more about why that is, and time may well be one of those factors.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's super important that that's something that we're very intentional about sharing when we talk about the red zone. And so that's kind of on the research side. You talked about what people should be doing to kind of better reflect diverse identities. I'm also curious about your opinion on how we, students, campus administrators, other people on college campuses, should change our approach to addressing the issue and educating people on the red zone now that we know that people with historically marginalized identities are at greater risk.
Yeah, that's another probably even larger question. I mean, the whole issue of prevention, we do have some research, and this is work done by Charlene Sen and colleagues, looking at the effect of training women in self-defense techniques, and I believe in self-esteem enhancement. Um, and the results of that research are actually really striking. I mean, they got some incredible differences in prevalence rates between people that had gone through their program and people who had not. The issue, which has been talked about a lot in this field, of course, is that it's kind of like telling women to watch their drinks and travel in packs and, you know, all of the sorts of things where we are essentially telling, potential people who are potentially going to be victimized that they are responsible for making sure that they're not victimized. Um, so I think what we need to do in some ways is to flip the script, right? If we're going to tell women and other folks that they are especially at risk of being victimized, Why isn't it the case that we aren't communicating with men, who are the vast majority of the perpetrators, that they are at particularly high risk for being perpetrators? Right? You rarely see that. I mean, there's been some research looking at the kinds of messages that that institutions give their students about this issue, and the vast majority of those messages are directed at women, right? So it raises the question, um, and hopefully this isn't too sort of raw a way of putting it, but why is it that we seem to shy away from giving men the message that they shouldn't be sexually assaulting other people? I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for that, but you know, I think that in some ways we need to, at least part of what we need to do is to get to that point, right? It's like it's easier to warn potential victims, or easier to, you know, say, you know, you can protect yourself from becoming a survivor of campus sexual assault by doing X, Y, and Z. Um, Much more difficult for some reason to tell, again, mostly men, you know, you can do X, Y, and Z to prevent yourself from becoming a perpetrator. Um, you know, and the reasons, I mean, if you think about this ecologically in terms of that ecological model, it is likely related to all kinds of things, like, you know, the fact that we are a society based on a neoliberal ideology that causes us to think that competitiveness, you know, is better than cooperation. And that sort of filters down to you know, to people's behavior in any number of different ways. So I think part of what we need to do is to change our messaging. I also think that part of what we need to do, and this isn't just me, I mean, this is, you know, I think there's pretty wide agreement on this in the research field, that much of the change is going to need to be structural, right? That you can give people just so much prevention education, you know, alcohol EDU or whatever it might be. But until you change the aspects of, say, a campus social intimacy culture that give men the vast majority of the power, you know, until you really equalize power relationships, and however that looks on, you know, each individual campus. Um, I think until we do that, we're gonna still, you know, um, have considerable prevalence rates of this problem. And that's really tough to do, but there are some research programs that have been working in that kind of direction. I would say the one that there are a number that I think are terrific. The one that I'm most familiar with is the SHIFT program at Columbia, which is a multidisciplinary program where they are paying attention to this problem in the using sort of ecological thinking, right? So they're thinking about things like how does the geography of student housing relate to whether or not people are assaulting or are being assaulted. Um, and I think, you know, we need to be thinking about those things. I mean, what kinds of rules, for example, are used in fraternities and sororities when it has to do with, say, who gets to have parties, or whether or not somebody gets to stay overnight or what have you. Are those rules different? And do the differences in those rules have some relationship to you know, the fact that women are assaulted at, you know, much higher rates than at least straight men. Um, you know, and those are difficult things to, you know, to talk about, let alone to implement, but I think that we need to start talking about them, because without systemic change, we're probably not going to get very much farther.
I completely agree. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with talking about how we need to alter our messaging around education with campus sexual violence and the red zone as well. So I think it's super important that we focus on how we can make those structural shifts, even though we're just individuals as well. Um, so I'd like to talk a little bit about a criticism of the red zone. And we discussed already how the research is a little bit shaky on even if its existence is really valid in the scientific field. Um, but one thing I've heard is that the red zone can create a false sense of safety from sexual violence outside of this kind of August to November timeframe. And so I'm curious how you think we can effectively address the red zone without minimizing the prevalence of campus sexual violence throughout the rest of the year. What sort of strategies do you think could ensure a more comprehensive approach that also could account for the increased risks during a campus's red zone or red zones?
Yeah, another really, really good question. Um, I think that, when I think about, say, first year students and going through first year orientation and how they're frequently, bombarded with all kinds of information that they have very little hope of actually remembering, right? I mean, it's just all this stuff, and then there are parties and fun things going on, and all of that. And we often assume that a single presentation about something like the red zone or about campus sexual assault more broadly is going to be a kind of one and done, and that's enough, right? We've told them, we've sort of done our due diligence, and that's it. I think sort of extrapolating from my experience in teaching undergraduates in psychology courses, if there are messages that you want them to remember, telling them once is not going to be enough. You need to tell them, and you need to remind them, you need to tell them again. Um, and certainly there are, assault prevention programs that do that sort of thing, that have programming throughout the year. But I think that's really important, right? So we've got, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is in April. But why is it just 1 month, right? Is 1 month enough? Um, I'm pretty certain that it's really not enough, that we need to be doing this kind of messaging, throughout the year. And from a research perspective, again, we need to be asking about times of the year to find out if there are, in fact, significant differences in prevalence rates of assault from one period of time to another. And there are some time periods that we almost invariably miss, that that is very rarely asked about. So, for example, the most campus climate surveys get done during the school year, right? So what that means is that if you assume, say, a college like mine, where students are here for 4 years, and you give them a survey in the middle of the fall, um, even seniors, even fourth year students are not going to have been on campus for a full 4 years. And first years are only going to have been on campus for, maybe a month or two. So what are we missing there? Well, some of the things that we're missing are things, traditions, like on some campuses, there's a period of time between the end of finals and commencement or graduation called senior week, right? Where at least a lot of people, take off for some place that's nice and warm, and they have a great time and all that. Do we know anything about the risk of sexual assault during senior week? I I don't think we do. Um, there are lots of different sort of pockets of context within the academic life of college students that we have only barely begun to scratch the surface on. Um, and it's kind of an old thing that people get sick of researchers saying, but it really is true that we need more research to be able to answer these kinds of questions, because having answers to those questions is what we need in order to be able to provide data for making the argument that we need the kinds of structural changes that are going to equalize power among the genders. Um, so anyway, I hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's really important, like you said, that we need to look at the whole context. And so it's really great to hear you emphasizing how we shouldn't just be focusing on these one-time periods, but we need to really be looking at school-specific context, region-specific context, and culturally specific context.
Yeah,
Um,
one thing that I didn't talk about that I probably should have, that you mentioned in your question, is focus on a red zone, taking focus away from other periods that might be as risky or even more risky. Um, I think that's, you know, potentially the case. But I suppose there's probably also a limit in the extent to which you can, keep doing the same kind of messaging, day in, day out. Um, so there's probably a happy medium there somewhere. I don't know that um, that messaging about the red zone is necessarily leading people to suddenly, drop their defenses, after Thanksgiving, in the first year or during their second semester or during subsequent semesters. Um, so it's an interesting question, but one that we don't really have data to be able to answer.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that and for answering all of these kind of really big questions surrounding the red zone and campus sexual violence. Now we'd like to hear directly from everyone else on this talk. We're going to do a little bit of a live Q&A. If you have any questions for Dr. Flack that might have been raised during his presentation or hearing some of his comments on these previous questions, please send them directly to Kenyora via the chat right now, and we're going to do our best to answer as many as we can in the time left. If you're comfortable with us sharing your first name, feel free to include it with your question. But if you prefer to remain anonymous, no worries. Just send your question anonymously and we'll respect your privacy. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started with our first submitted question. So someone is wondering what the literature or research says about best practices in prevention work, working with populations who might be at risk of doing harm or perpetrating violence.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And unfortunately, it's one that I don't, I don't have expertise in the area of prevention or dealing with campus perpetrators. I do know that the old literature, in terms of trying to prevent adjudicated rapists from reoffending, indicated that most of the programming, but again, this goes back a ways, like at least 10 years or so, most of the programs that had been tried with that population were actually based on programs that had been designed for child rapists, that is, for adults who were raping children. And, not surprisingly, they didn't turn up very good evidence for their effectiveness. But I don't know about campus-based programs for men that are pursuing, you know, prevention. There may be such programs, and I'm simply not aware of them. I mean, one of the really positive things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that there's been an explosion of research on campus sexual assault. It used to be that, like back in 2000 or even 2010, that you could be an expert in this field and pretty much know all of the research that had been published. Um, that's becoming difficult to the point of almost being impossible. at this point because there's simply so much research. Thankfully, we have a fair number of literature reviews that help those of us out who are not working in particular areas. But sorry, I don't have a better answer to that question.
Well, thank you for sharing what you know about it. Another participant is wondering if there's any known relationship between on-campus faith-based organizations and sexual violence.
That's another really good question. And do you mean uh, a relationship between people who are members of faith-based organizations, or like students who are members, say, of a Catholic or a Jewish group or something like that, um, or something else?
I think that is what they are saying.
Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, certainly there has been speculation about um, membership in religious organizations being something of a protective factor. Um, but I don't know of any data analyses that have been reported specifically on that. For example, comparing prevalence rates of people who are like atheists or agnostic or are, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu. I don't, there may be some comparative analyses out there, and I'm just not familiar with them. It would be interesting to know if those are protective factors. I suspect that, or I would suspect, but who knows if it would turn out this way, that um, probably religious affiliation would end up interacting with some other factors in terms of either being relatively protective or not with respect to victimization. So, for example, it might be that folks within some religious traditions would be less likely to participate in campus intimacy cultures. Clearly, if you're not participating in that culture, you're much less likely to be assaulted.
Yes, that's very interesting. Definitely an area that I agree we need more research on, not just faith-based organizations, but just various. I mean, we know Greek life increases risk of sexual violence, but other organizations that might do the same. Um, Another participant is wondering if you anticipate there having been any impacts on the red zone due to COVID-19, with campuses being closed for 1 to 2 years, and also there being a lot of changes across Title IX offices nationally.
Yeah, that's another really interesting and important question. Um, I am aware that there is some data. I don't know if it's been published yet, but I know that some researchers have been looking at that period. My research group looked at that period. I had a graduate student um, uh, who actually did an analysis of the relative prevalence rates from a time period prior to the COVID-19 lockdown to the COVID-19 period. And actually, what she found was that, if anything, the rate of assault seemed to increase, which frankly was surprising to us because we thought that with all of the rules about people not going to parties and other kinds of super spreader events, and maybe just hanging out with a smaller number of people, that somehow that I mean it would seem to make sense, right, that that would reduce the level of risk. But at least in our data, that did not seem to be the case. Now, I should add very quickly that we have not yet published those data, so they have not yet been peer reviewed. And I wouldn't want to, reach any firm conclusions, at least based on our own research, before, our findings have gone all the way through that quality control process.
Great. Thank you so much. Another participant says, thank you so much for your work. and also that red zone programming is deeply embedded in many campuses nationwide. And so they imagine that hearing that there is little research to support this premise of a red zone is probably pretty shocking for some people. And so they're wondering if you have any suggestions on how to approach people who are committed to this messaging, to help our campuses have evidence-based and evidence-informed programs.
Right. So the first thing that I would recommend is that if your campus isn't already doing a campus climate survey focused on gender-based violence, that it do that. And if it doesn't have expertise among its staff sufficient to carry out that kind of survey, that they hire people who could do that. And there's certainly folks, consulting firms and other folks who are available to help campuses out with that. I think that, yeah, it's certainly disappointing that the research is inconsistent with the messaging. But I think once you have information about your campus, and you can say something about whether or not there is risk related to time or related to other risk factors, and there are a whole bunch of them, the messaging might be changed so that perhaps, if it's the case that time is not as important a predictor on, say, a particular campus as other predictors are, that the messaging be changed. I think one of the reasons that it would be difficult to let go of red zone messaging is that the idea makes such good sense, right? It's almost like common sense, right? You've got people who have no experience, being away from home in the way they are when they're away at college or university. They have no experience of how to navigate the social intimacy scene and culture. And so in some ways, this notion that, that at least some people are kind of sitting ducks, right, for other people who've been around a while and who know how to manipulate that scene to their advantage. It's a narrative that certainly makes sense. And it's one that also may well be consistent with what's going on some campuses. So to say that we don't have, enough evidence at this point to be confident that this is the case, across all colleges and universities is a different thing than saying, the red zone doesn't exist. It may well. We simply don't have, the data to be able to confidently say that, yes, this is true, everywhere.
Thank you for that distinction. I think that's really good to kind of distinguish between all campuses versus being able to say something about a specific campus or a more local zone. Stop Sexual Assault in School would like to know if you're aware of any research specific to sexual assault of college students who haven't yet reached age 18.
So students who are younger than 18 but at school.
Yes.
Or at college or university. Well, the quick answer is no. I don't know about any research on that. I suspect that kind of research is difficult to do because, unlike people who are 18 and older, if you are less than 18, you would have to have your parents' permission to participate in the kind of research that we do with campus climate surveys that ask about victimization. And I think that it makes the process more complicated and more difficult. And there may be a supposition that the parents would not give their permission for students who are younger than 18 to participate in that kind of research. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to think about different factors that might might be responsible for what I think is a lack of research on that particular question. I don't remember. There may be in some of the larger studies uh, some of those analyses, but my guess is that there aren't, if only because of that additional layer of complication that's required legally when you're asking minors to divulge that kind of information.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it would make sense that there wouldn't be much research out there about that. So unfortunately, this is our last question, but I feel it's a very important question. A participant is wondering, since students with disabilities face the highest rates of sexual violence, how do we ensure that our campuses provide the same protections for people and students with disabilities as their able-bodied peers, especially in messaging surrounding this research and the red zone?
Okay, so I don't doubt that people with disabilities are victimized. I'm not aware of research that indicates that people with disabilities have higher prevalence rates of sexual victimization on college campuses than people who do not have disabilities. But just because I'm not aware of it doesn't mean, that it doesn't exist. I'd certainly, appreciate seeing any such research. I'm just simply not aware of it.
Okay. I think that is unfortunately the last question that we have time for. I'm going to hand it over to Kenyora for a little closing note.
Well, as we come to the end of today's webinar, I just want to take a moment to express our deepest gratitude to Dr. Bill Flack for sharing his expertise, and to Catherine for her thoughtful moderation. We definitely got a lot of great questions, and so I definitely want to let folks know that maybe Dr. Flack, we will send you some of the questions that we've received that we weren't able to get to, and then we'll definitely follow up with folks via email. But again, just want to say thank you so much. Your insights and guidance have really provided us with a clearer understanding of the red zone, or what we thought was the red zone, and the crucial steps that we can take to foster a more supportive campus environment. I also want to take the time to thank each and every one of you who has been on this webinar with us, for engaging in this critical conversation, and for your ongoing commitment to supporting survivors and advocating for change. The work we do together is vital in transforming this high-risk period of the red zone into one of safety, awareness, and empowerment. So as we can continue with our Reclaim Red Zones campaign, I encourage you to take what you've learned today and apply it within your own communities. Share this knowledge, support those around you, and remember that each of us has the power to make a difference. And to keep learning more about the work in Dr. Flack's field, we will be sharing several resources that Dr. Flack has kindly provided us in a follow-up email to this talk. So we'll send this recording, we'll send those resources, and we'll definitely provide you with those follow-ups to some of the questions that some of y'all had answered that we were not able to get to today. So in that spirit, I'd like to invite you to sign up for our Reclaim Red Zones campaign if you have not already. By joining, you'll receive access to a wealth of resources, be the first to know about future webinars, hear exciting announcements about new initiatives aimed at empowering survivors and fostering safer campus environments. So this is more than just a campaign, it's a movement, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So to sign up, simply visit our website or follow the link that we'll be sharing in the chat. Together, we can amplify our impact and ensure that the Red Zone becomes a time of safety, support, and advocacy. So thank you again for your participation today. Take care. We look forward to seeing you at our future events and campaigns. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.